By now, you will not be surprised to hear that I love architecture. I grew up in Chicago, surrounded by many of the great architectural works of the 20th century. I'd like to start today's lecture with a little architectural tour. What do these two buildings have in common? Think for a moment. Well, the building pictured on the left is the Hong Kong headquarters of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC. It is one of the buildings on Hong Kong Island that participates in the famous nightly light show, and the picture shows the light display in early evening. The building on the right is the HSBC building on Fifth Avenue in New York City. What about the next two buildings? What do they have in common? Well, I guess the UBS logo is the obvious answer. But what does UBS stand for? The left picture shows the entrance from the Bahnhofstrasse in Zurich to the Union Bank of Switzerland, UBS, headquarters. An interesting tidbit about UBS is that years ago, it chose a name that would allow it to use the corporate symbol UBS in German, French, Italian, and English. The image on the right is the UBS Tower on Wacker Drive in downtown Chicago. Finally, although I'm sure you have caught on by now, what do these last two pictures have in common? The left building is the Bank of America Tower in Atlanta, Georgia. When I first moved to North Carolina many years ago, I opened an account at North Carolina National Bank. In time, North Carolina National Bank grew to become Nations Bank, and then it grew again to become Bank of America. And the building pictured on the right? It's the Bank of America building in Canada Square, London, England. My lecture today has two parts. In the first, I'd like to return to the topic of exchange rates and explain that different forces tend to account for short-run exchange rate movements and long-run exchange rate movements. But in the second part of the lecture, we're going to take a look at international banking, hence the architectural tour. And I'll argue that international banks play an ever-increasing role in finance, and I'll explain why this is so. You'll want to know why these ideas are important. Well, to fully understand how monetary policy works and to fully appreciate the trade-offs involved with a particular monetary policy strategy, one must understand why exchange rates are important and how exchange rates are affected by various economic forces, including those associated with monetary policy. And it's also important to understand the costs and benefits of opening a nation's financial markets to financial firms from around the globe. Now, I chose the pairs of pictures very carefully. Foreign-owned banks, even Asian banks, operate in the United States. But American banks also operate in many foreign nations. Okay. My first point is that in the short run, over short horizons, exchange rates are sensitive to movements in interest rates. Now, everything I'm going to say about exchange rates in today's lecture is fully compatible with the demand and supply model for exchange rates that we saw in the last lecture. But today, I am looking at additional theory that asks whether we can say more about the equilibrium in exchange rate markets than simply that equilibrium exchange rates are determined by demand and supply. It's important to understand that most of the trades in the foreign exchange market are trades involving bank deposits denominated in one currency for bank deposits denominated in another. Now, banks hold deposits in different currencies. Why? Well, for customers who demand foreign currencies because they wish to purchase goods for import, and also for customers who supply foreign currencies because they export to different countries. Banks regard deposits in different currencies to be very close substitutes for one another. Since there is an active foreign exchange market that allows them to quickly convert a deposit in one currency into a deposit in a different currencies. Banks prefer, of course, to earn interest on their deposits and will often do so by using those deposits to purchase short maturity government and corporate debt. When interest rates in one country, say the United Kingdom, rise relative to interest rates in another country, say the United States, banks are likely to convert some of their dollar deposits into pound deposits so that they can buy the higher yield securities and benefit from the higher rates in the UK. Put another way, international deposits are very nimble. Banks quickly move them from one country to another. When doing so will allow the bank to earn more interest. So an interesting question is, when will a bank be indifferent between holding, say, dollars and pound deposits? We have some theory. The interest parity condition defines equilibrium among domestic interest rates, foreign interest rates, and the relevant exchange rate. Put another way, the interest parity condition is a relationship between, say, interest rates in the United States, interest rates in the UK, and the exchange rate between the pound and the dollar. The equilibrium is one where banks expect to earn the same interest denominated in their own currency, whether they hold their deposits in dollars or whether they hold them in pounds. And of course, pounds is just an example. The condition would hold for when the alternative deposits were in yen or euros. Okay, how to think about this? Well, let's think what the bank could do. A bank could hold dollar deposits and earn, let us say, the U.S. interest rate, RUS. We'll think of that as the U.S. Treasury bill rate. But alternatively, that same bank could buy pounds with its dollars, earn RUK, a comparable rate on short-term British Treasury debt, and then sell the pounds back for dollars one period later. It's less important to say what specific asset the bank would choose to hold if it keeps its funds in the United States, but it is important that we compare the United States and the United Kingdom rates on comparable United Kingdom and United States securities. And what do I mean by comparable? I mean securities that have the same maturities and the same perceived riskiness. A bank is assumed to be indifferent between these two strategies I've just outlined when both strategies yield the same number of dollars for the bank per dollar in period T plus 1. At the time that a bank decides where to hold its deposits, it does not know, and this is important, the value of the exchange rate one period later. So the interest parity condition we're about to see substitutes the forecasted value of the exchange rate for its actual value at time T plus 1. Okay, we need to have a couple of symbols here. So let capital E at time T be the number of pounds required to buy a dollar at time T. Let capital E with a E superscript at time T plus 1 be the bank's best forecast of what the exchange rate, the number of pounds per dollar, will be at time T plus 1. Now that forecast is going to be made at time T when the bank is deciding what asset to hold, whether it's better to hold dollars or pounds. Now, exactly what is the interest parity condition? The interest parity condition is that the interest rate in the UK, RUK at time T, must in equilibrium be equal to the interest rate in the US at time T, adjusted for expected percentage changes in the exchange rate. That's that second term on the right-hand side. And what is that expected percentage change in exchange rates? Symbolically, it is E expected at time T plus 1 minus E, so the change in the exchange rate, but then that difference divided by E to convert it into percentage terms. Okay? In equilibrium, the UK interest rate will equal the US interest rate plus the percentage appreciation in the dollar expected over the period from T to T plus 1. Okay? Suppose, for example, that interest rates in Britain increase and interest rates in the US do not. What would this situation do? Well, this situation will lead deposits to flow from the US to the UK as banks decide to try to participate in these higher UK interest rates. And this will increase the supply of dollars in the dollar-pound exchange market. And this in turn, remember our demand and supply model from last time, will cause E to fall to the point where E is expected to change back to its previous level, to appreciate. And that appreciation in the dollar just offsets the difference between UK and US interest rates. Okay, so what are we saying again? If we look at the formula one more time, we're saying that one alternative for the bank is to hold deposits in the UK and earn RUK. A second alternative is to hold deposits in the US and earn RUS. But in order to compare apples to apples rather than apples to oranges, we have to adjust RUS for the expected percentage change in the exchange rate between dollars and pounds that will occur over the period under consideration. The interest parity condition makes that adjustment and then says banks will be indifferent when RUK is equal to RUS plus the expected rate of exchange change, the expected rate of change in the exchange rate. Now, the bank doesn't have to bear the risk associated with changes in the exchange rate. It might decide to hedge this foreign exchange risk. How would it do that? Well, if it wanted to hedge this exchange rate risk, it would simultaneously buy pounds and then at the same time sell them one period forward using that derivative contract that we learned about earlier. And there is a corresponding equilibrium condition when banks do hedge the risk, and that equilibrium condition is called covered interest parity. Now when we look at our formula, we see that we've replaced the expected rate of exchange between the dollar and the pound at time t plus 1 with a symbol called ft plus 1. And ft plus 1 is the forward market price of the dollar in terms of pounds. Keep in mind that the bank knows ft plus 1, ET, RUST, and RUKT when it makes a decision. So it has perfect knowledge of what the rate of return will be if it holds its deposits in the US or in the UK. So economists truly believe that covered interest parity is a very good description of short-term equilibrium in foreign exchange and interest-bearing asset markets. Well, while a lot of work has been done by economists to test various versions of the interest parity theory, explaining that work is certainly beyond the scope of these lectures. The simple fact is that understanding the work involves understanding a lot of highly specialized and technical issues. But we can get a feel for whether or not the exchange rates move with interest rates as predicted by interest parity. And the diagram you're seeing now is going to help us do that. That diagram shows you two lines. The red line is the difference between the 3-month Treasury bill rate in the UK and the US. When UK rates are higher, the corresponding point on the red line is positive. When UK rates are lower, it's negative. When the US rate is higher, as it was in the early 1980s when Paul Volcker's Fed raised interest rates and wrung inflation out of the US economy, then the corresponding point on the red line is negative below the horizontal axis. But there's a second line. The blue line is the exchange rate measured in pounds per dollar. Pounds per dollar. Okay? What do we see in the diagram? Well, we see that when UK rates increase relative to US rates, the dollar tends to depreciate, lower number of pounds per dollar. But when US rates increase relative to UK rates, the dollar tends to appreciate, higher number of pounds per dollar. And this is precisely what the theory predicts. The lines don't match perfectly. The correlations are not perfect. But we do see that interest rates and exchange rates move together as predicted by interest parity. Well, in the long run, economists believe that a different set of economic forces tends to explain exchange rate movements. In the long run, economists argue, exchange rates tend to move with price indexes in the countries in question. And the theory that predicts that is called the law of one price. And this is a it's not a law, of course, it's a theory, but the law of one price is very, very intuitive. It says that identical goods, or goods that are very close substitutes, should sell for the same price in every country. An example will help. Let's consider a ton of high-quality steel with a price of PUS, all right? Suppose the same quality steel is also produced in the UK and has a price in pounds sterling of PUK. So we've got PUS for the steel in the US, PUK for the steel in the United Kingdom. First of all, let's understand that the law of one price does not say that PUS should equal PUK. That would be silly. It would not make sense because the first price is in dollars and the second price is in pounds. The law of one price says that PUS should equal PUK divided by E, where E is the number of pounds it takes to buy a dollar. Why? Well, the term on the right in that equation is the number of dollars required to purchase a ton of high-quality steel in the United Kingdom. And the term on the left is the number of dollars required to purchase a ton of high-quality steel produced in the United States. The economic force at work behind the law of one price is Adam Smith's self-interest. Self-interested decision makers will buy their high-quality steel from whatever source is the cheapest. If producers want to sell high-quality steel, they will have to meet the best price available in the world when it's adjusted for the exchange rate. Otherwise, they'll be driven out of business. Now, the skeptic will quickly argue that transportation costs, tariffs, and other impediments will keep self-interested decision makers from importing cheaper steel. But the proponent of the law of one price has a response. The proponent will argue that the law is supposed to hold in the long run, and that in the long run, forces will be at work to get around tariffs, get around transportation costs, and get around other impediments to trade. Interestingly, the law of one price provides us with a theory of long-run movements in exchange rates. If we assume that the law of one price holds, approximately at least, for a large number of goods that are consumed and produced throughout the world, then the theory tells us that the exchange rate should equal the ratio PUK divided by PUS. When now, though, we have to interpret PUK and PUS as price indexes of goods in the United Kingdom and in the United States. Evidence in favor of the law of one price and of the theory of long-run exchange rate movements predicted by the law of one price is present in the diagram you are now seeing. That diagram plots the exchange rate in dollars per pound sterling for a long period of time, 1913 to 2004. And in the same diagram is plotted an adjusted ratio of the country's consumer price indices during the same period. The adjusted ratio represents an estimate of the ratio of the costs of market baskets in the United States and in the United Kingdom. What do you see in the diagram? Well, to me, the diagram makes clear that over the long run, exchange rates do track relative prices. The law of one price is behind the so-called Big Mac Index constructed annually by The Economist magazine. The Economist prices Big Macs, I mean the hamburger, in many different economies and then uses exchange rates to convert the Big Mac prices to the dollar. In 2010, The Economist used the index to estimate countries that had overvalued and undervalued currencies. According to the Big Mac Index, Switzerland, Brazil, the Eurozone, and Canada had overvalued currencies. For example, the dollar equivalent price of a Big Mac purchased in Switzerland with Swiss francs was a whopping $6.78. Also, according to the Big Mac Index, China, Thailand, Mexico, and South Korea all had undervalued currencies. For example, the price equivalent of a Big Mac purchased in China with renminbi was only $2.18. So the Economist agrees that China has undervalued its currency. Now, the U.S. price used for a Big Mac purchased in the United States was $3.71, which was an average of Big Mac prices observed on October 13th, 2010, in a couple of different United States cities. So the Big Mac Index adds weight to the argument presented in the last lecture that China has kept the exchange value of the renminbi artificially low. Now let's turn to the question of international banking and come to realize that international banking is a crucial feature of the increased globalization of modern economies. International banking has grown at a rapid rate in the past 50 years. In 1960, only 8 U.S. banks operated in foreign countries and had total assets of less than $4 billion. Today, more than 100 U.S. banks have branches in foreign countries, and their assets total more than $2 trillion. Economist Frederick Mishkin reckons that the growth in international banking has been driven by 3 forces. First, there has been tremendous growth in international trade in the past 50 years. Adam Smith would be happy. Second, U.S. banks have found it profitable to enter the investment banking business in foreign countries. In particular, they like to help foreign corporations create and market new stock and bond issues. And third, U.S. banks want access to the euro-dollar market. What's that? Well, a euro-dollar is a deposit outside the United States that is nevertheless denominated in dollars. London is the center of trading in euro-dollar deposits. The euro-dollar market was begun when the Soviet Union decided not to hold its dollar deposits in the United States. It was afraid that the United States might seize them. But the Soviets did want to hold their deposits in dollars rather than marks or francs because they regarded dollars to be more stable in value and more readily accepted. The euro-dollar market was born. But today, many foreign corporations want to hold dollars in foreign banks to facilitate transactions associated with their export, import, and securities operations. By the way, the minimum transaction in the euro-dollar market is about $1 million, so clearly big players play here. Foreign banks operate in the United States in 3 ways. Agency offices of foreign banks can lend and transfer funds in the United States, but cannot accept deposits. But a foreign subsidiary of a U.S. bank has the rights and obligations of U.S. banks. And finally, a foreign branch, like those that own the buildings shown at the beginning of this lecture, are typically full-service banks formed as EDGE Act facilities under U.S. law or as an international banking facility under regulations approved by the Federal Reserve. You know, the United States has only recently developed a truly national banking system. Other developed economies have had national banks for years. This is so because for most of the 20th century, banks in the United States were subject to regional legal requirements that made it difficult for them to operate across state lines. As a result, there are more banks per capita in the United States than is typical in other economies, although, as you read in the media, consolidation is ongoing. Banks in the United States are not big relative to the largest banks in the world. The Banker's Almanac lists the top 9 banks in the world by assets on December 31st, 2010. JP Morgan Chase is the only U.S. bank to make the top 9. Bank of America is only number 12. UBS is number 16th. And HSBC is number 44, although its London bank ranks higher. So, what should we make of all this? Permit me to leave you with a couple of thoughts. Economic forces do not respect national boundaries. The interest parity condition tells us that the value of a dollar depends on interest rates elsewhere in the world. And the purchasing power parity condition tells us that in the long run, the value of the dollar depends on how we price important resources relative to their prices elsewhere in the world. And the exchange rate is a very important economics price that affects the desirability of our exports and the cost of our imports. Finally, there may be no more obvious sign that we live in a shrinking world than the fact that banks are truly multinational corporations. Look around and find out what those corporate monikers, such as UBS, HSBC, and RBC, mean.